When a security guard blocked a young man from entering an art auction because of his paint-stained clothes, everyone turned away except Keanu Reeves. What happened next silenced the entire room, challenged the meaning of art, and revealed the true value of color in a way no one saw coming. Before we continue this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another inspiring story you won't want to miss. The lobby of the Westfield Art Hall shimmered beneath chandeliers that looked like falling stars. Outside, luxury cars rolled up one by one, doors opening for people dressed in designer gowns and pressed tuxedos. Laughter echoed through the marble foyer, the kind that comes from those certain of their place in the world. It was a night where art was currency and reputation was the highest bid. At the entrance, a man in faded jeans and a paint-splattered work shirt hesitated near the velvet rope. His name was Luis Ortega. He clutched a small wrapped canvas against his chest, as if protecting a piece of his soul. Sweat gathered at his brow, though the night air was cool. He looked up at the banners fluttering above the doors, charity gala and art auction, celebrating modern masters. The words stung. He had dreamed of seeing his art in a place like this. But he wasn't here to sell, just to deliver. A tall security guard noticed him and straightened. "Sir, this is a private event. Guests only." His tone wasn't cruel, but firm, the tone of someone who'd said the same line 100 times before. Luis swallowed. "I'm just here to drop something off. A painting." He lifted the canvas slightly. The guard's eyes moved from the wrapped frame to Luis's worn boots and dried paint under his fingernails. "You're a delivery guy?" "Not exactly," Luis said quietly. "It's for one of the organizers." "Which one?" Luis opened his mouth, but hesitated. The truth was, he didn't know. A friend of a friend had told him that an artist's submission might be accepted for review at this gala. He had saved for weeks to buy the materials for that single painting. He had nothing more to offer but hope. The guard frowned. "I'm going to need a name. Otherwise, you'll have to leave it here." Luis tightened his grip on the painting. "It's fragile. I can't just leave it on the floor." Behind the guard, laughter burst again from inside as another guest walked through the double doors. Photographers' flashes flickered like lightning. The guard sighed, impatient. "Look, man, I'm just doing my job. People are paying thousands to get in. You understand?" "I do," Luis said softly. "That's why I came early." The guard stepped forward, hand hovering near the rope. "I'm sorry, sir, but dressed like that, you can't enter. You'll make people uncomfortable." Luis looked down at his clothes, then at the wrapped canvas. The words stung worse than he expected. He forced a small smile. "I didn't mean to cause trouble." A few guests glanced over as they passed. One woman whispered something to her husband. Another laughed under her breath. Luis's ears burned. He wanted to disappear, but the painting felt heavier now, as if it carried his worth in every brushstroke. Just then, the valet outside opened the door for someone arriving late. The crowd inside stirred with sudden interest. Cameras were lifted, flashes ready. Keanu Reeves stepped through quietly, wearing a simple black suit and carrying a paper coffee cup. No entourage, no fanfare. His calm presence contrasted the vanity around him. He nodded politely to a few people but seemed detached, lost in thought. As he moved toward the registration table, he noticed the commotion near the door. A guard standing too tall. A man shrinking beneath the weight of humiliation. Luis's hand trembled as he adjusted the painting under his arm, trying to explain again that he wasn't trespassing. Keanu's gaze lingered on the young man's face, the same weary look he'd seen on countless hard-working people dismissed for how they looked, not who they were. Something in him shifted. He set his coffee cup down on a nearby table and began walking toward the door. The guard didn't see him at first. He was too busy repeating his rulebook lines. "Sir, please, I'm asking you nicely to step back." Luis nodded, trying to hide the hurt in his eyes. "I understand." He turned slightly toward the sidewalk, the crowd behind the rope blurring into soundless shapes. That's when the murmurs began. "Is that Wade? That's Keanu Reeves." Heads turned. Conversations paused. Phones were subtly raised to record. Keanu stopped a few feet away, his expression unreadable. "Something wrong?" he asked the guard in a quiet, even tone. The guard froze, realizing who he was talking to. "Mr. Reeves?" "No, sir, just this gentleman doesn't have credentials." Keanu glanced at Luis. "What's your name?" "Luis," the young man replied, his voice almost a whisper. "Luis?" Keanu repeated softly, then looked back at the guard. "He's with me." The crowd behind them fell silent. Someone gasped. Another whispered, "Is he serious?" The guard blinked. "Sir, I didn't know." Keanu cut him off gently. "It's all right. You do your job well. But he comes in." Luis stared at him, unsure if this was real. "You don't have to." Keanu smiled slightly. "I think I do." He stepped forward and held the door open, motioning for Luis to enter first. The guard hesitated but moved aside. Cameras flashed. Inside, the gala chatter resumed, but now it was tinted with curiosity. Everyone wanted to know why Keanu Reeves had just walked in with a man in paint-stained jeans and a nervous look in his eyes. Luis took a slow breath, clutching the painting tighter, and followed Keanu through the doors. Inside, the air smelled faintly of champagne and expensive perfume. Polished marble floors reflected the glow of chandeliers, while soft classical music drifted from a live quartet near the stage. Luis's boots squeaked against the floor as he walked in beside Keanu, the sound out of place amid the quiet grace of the room. Dozens of heads turned. Some guests smiled politely, others whispered. One woman leaned toward her husband. "Is that a janitor? Why is he with Keanu Reeves?" Her words, meant to be discreet, carried farther than she thought. Luis lowered his eyes, wishing he could vanish into the walls. Keanu placed a steady hand on his shoulder. "Ignore them," he said quietly. "They see what they expect. You're here for what you create." Luis nodded, uncertain what to say. His hands trembled slightly as he adjusted his painting, still wrapped in brown paper. The auction host, Arthur Gray, noticed their arrival and approached with an elegant smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Mr. Reeves, always a pleasure." "We didn't expect you so early," Arthur said, extending a hand. "Good to see you, Arthur," Keanu replied evenly. "I wanted to bring a guest." Arthur's gaze flicked to Luis, then back to Keanu. "Ah, I see. A friend?" "Something like that," Keanu said. "An artist?" Arthur's eyebrows lifted in polite surprise, but his tone cooled. "How fascinating. Well, make yourselves comfortable. The auction begins shortly." As Arthur walked away, Luis exhaled shakily. Keanu turned to him with a calm smile. "Let's find a place to stand. You'll want to see what the world calls art tonight." Luis nodded, still stunned. For the first time in his life, he stood inside a room where every wall shimmered with paintings, yet none carried as much truth as the one in his arms. They found a quiet corner near the back of the room. Luis's reflection shimmered faintly in the polished glass. Beside him, reminding him how out of place he looked among the tailored suits and diamond necklaces, he clutched his canvas closer, feeling its edges press into his palms like an anchor. Keanu glanced at him with gentle curiosity. "You painted that yourself, didn't you?" Luis hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, I didn't mean to bring attention. I just thought someone here might give it a chance." Keanu studied him for a moment. "You were willing to walk through those doors, knowing they might not let you in. That takes courage." Luis tried to laugh, but it came out small and tired. "It's not courage, sir. It's desperation." Keanu shook his head slightly. "Maybe both." As he spoke, the auction lights dimmed. The host began announcing the evening schedule, his voice echoing through the hall. Spotlights bathed the stage in golden light as waiters passed trays of champagne. Guests leaned closer to admire glossy catalogs of the art on display. Each page listed paintings worth more than Luis had earned in a year. He saw the names of artists he had followed online, their portraits airbrushed to perfection. He imagined his own name printed there, Luis Ortega, painter of light. It was a foolish dream, but one that refused to fade. Keanu's gaze followed his. "Don't stop believing that your work belongs," he said softly. "Sometimes the world just needs to be reminded what real art looks like." Luis swallowed hard, his throat tight. For the first time that night, he let himself believe that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't invisible after all. The sound of crystal glasses and murmured conversation filled the room as the tension from the doorway slowly settled into quiet curiosity. Though the commotion had faded, eyes still trailed Luis as he followed Keanu deeper into the grand auction hall. Every step he took seemed to echo louder than it should, bouncing off marble and whispers. The security guard at the door still looked pale, his posture stiff with embarrassment. Moments earlier, he had spoken with authority. Now he simply stood in silence, glancing at Keanu with regret. "Mr. Reeves, I didn't know," he began, voice low. Keanu offered a calm smile, his tone steady. "It's all right, but he comes in." The words were simple, yet final. They carried the quiet gravity of someone who didn't need to raise his voice to command attention. Luis hesitated, caught between gratitude and confusion. "You don't have to," he whispered, barely audible over the crowd. Keanu turned to him, eyes warm, but resolute. "I think I do." He motioned for Luis to walk beside him, and together they entered the auction room. Guests tried to resume their conversations, but curiosity won out. Subtle glances followed them, some intrigued, some judgmental. Near the center of the hall stood Arthur Gray, the host and owner of Greystone Gallery. His tailored charcoal suit gleamed under the chandelier light, his silver cufflinks flashing as he gestured to guests with rehearsed charm. Arthur noticed Keanu approaching and immediately adjusted his posture. "Keanu Reeves," he called out with polished enthusiasm. "Always an honor to have you here." Keanu nodded politely. "Good evening, Arthur." Arthur extended his hand, smiling broadly. "We're just minutes away from beginning. Tonight's lineup is quite exceptional." His tone was smooth, practiced, but his eyes flicked toward Luis and lingered. Luis stood a few steps behind, shoulders slightly hunched, holding his wrapped canvas close to his chest. His paint-stained shirt and worn boots contrasted sharply with the gleaming parquet floor. He looked like a man who had stepped into a world that wasn't meant for him. Arthur's smile tightened. "And this must be your guest?" Keanu nodded. "Yes, Luis Ortega." Arthur tilted his head, politely, though the faint arch of his brow betrayed disapproval. "A pleasure," he said, extending a limp handshake that barely brushed Luis's fingers. "I must say, I wasn't aware we were expanding our guest list tonight." Keanu's tone remained kind, but his eyes didn't waver. Sometimes the best guests are unexpected. Arthur chuckled softly, trying to mask discomfort. Of course. Well, please, enjoy yourselves. We're starting in 5 minutes." As Arthur turned away, Luis exhaled, his throat dry. "I shouldn't be here," he murmured. Keanu glanced at him. "Why not?" Luis gestured faintly toward the crowd. "Look at them. They can tell I don't belong." Keanu's expression softened. "You belong anywhere your art can breathe." The young man looked down at his canvas again, hands trembling just slightly. He didn't know it yet, but those words would stay with him long after the night was over. Luis stood beside Keanu, his eyes scanning the crowd of wealthy patrons dressed in shimmering gowns and sleek suits. Waiters glided between tables like shadows, offering drinks on silver trays. The air was thick with perfume and money. Every conversation around him seemed to hum with polite arrogance, discussions of exclusive collections, private exhibits, and million-dollar bids. Luis clutched his painting tighter, afraid to even breathe too loudly. "They'll think I'm the help," he muttered under his breath. Keanu turned slightly toward him. "Then let them think what they want," he said quietly. "You know who you are." Luis managed a faint smile but couldn't shake the discomfort. His stomach twisted as he noticed people staring, whispering behind raised hands. He recognized the look. They weren't seeing a painter, only a man who didn't fit their image of refinement. Arthur Gray, meanwhile, had returned to the stage at the front of the hall. His voice rang confidently through the microphone as he welcomed the crowd. Ladies and gentlemen, tonight we celebrate art not only as beauty, but as legacy. Each brushstroke here tells a story of vision and sophistication. Luis almost laughed at that last word. Sophistication. It was everything he wasn't. His world was paint fumes, chipped brushes, and nights that ended with him washing his hands in cold water until the colors faded. He looked down at his fingers, still faintly stained with blue. Keanu noticed the movement. "You create something they can't buy," he said softly. "That makes them nervous." Before Luis could respond, a group of women passed by, their jeweled bracelets catching the light. One of them slowed as she noticed him. "Excuse me," she said to Keanu with a half smile. "I love your work. Will you be displaying tonight?" Keanu smiled politely. "I'm here to support others." Her gaze flicked to Luis. "Oh, how wonderful," she said, clearly not meaning it. "And what do you do?" Luis hesitated. "I paint," he said simply. Her smile faltered. "Oh, how nice." She turned back to her friends, and their soft laughter trailed behind her as they walked away. Luis's chest tightened. "This was a mistake," he whispered. Keanu looked at him with calm assurance. "No, it's just the wrong audience. That doesn't mean your art is wrong." Across the room, Arthur was speaking with donors, his voice rising above the soft music. "We'll be starting the first bidding with one of our most anticipated pieces, an abstract from the Greystone collection, valued at $80,000. Luis's eyes moved to the painting being displayed. It was bold, large, and technically impressive, but it felt lifeless. The strokes were perfect, the composition clean, yet something was missing. It lacked warmth. It lacked truth. Keanu followed his gaze. "Do you like it?" Luis paused. "It's expensive." Keanu smiled faintly. "That's not the same thing." For the first time that night, Luis chuckled quietly, the sound breaking through his anxiety. It was the beginning of trust, a fragile bridge built between two men who saw the world through very different frames, but shared the same understanding of what beauty meant. The host's voice echoed again, announcing the next item up for bidding. The auctioneer's rhythmic tone filled the hall, and paddles lifted gracefully as the numbers rose higher. Luis stood back, watching the way people competed not for love of the art, but for the applause that came after. Each bid sounded like a contest of pride. He whispered, "They're not buying what they feel. They're buying what others will notice." Keanu nodded, eyes focused on the crowd. "You see more than they do, Luis. That's what makes you an artist." The young man looked at him uncertainly. "You talk like you've done this before." Keanu smiled slightly. "I've seen a lot of people mistake noise for meaning. It's not that different." Luis looked down, his grip on the painting loosening a little. "I painted this one for my father," he said quietly. "He was a house painter, spent his whole life covering walls other people owned. He used to tell me, 'We bring color to their homes, but we live in gray.' I didn't want that to be my story." Keanu's gaze softened. "And yet here you are, trying to change it." Before Luis could answer, Arthur returned with his charming but strained smile. "Keanu, I wanted to thank you again for attending. Always a joy to have a man of your caliber at these events." His tone carried both respect and calculation. Keanu gave a small nod. "Happy to be here." Arthur's eyes flicked to the wrapped canvas in Luis's hands. "And your guest, does he represent a gallery?" Luis shook his head. "No, sir." Arthur raised an eyebrow. "Ah, a hobbyist then." His voice was polite, but the faint smirk at the edge of his mouth revealed the condescension. Behind it, Keanu's tone remained calm. "He's a painter." Arthur chuckled softly, as if amused. "Well, we all dabble in creativity in our own ways. Perhaps one day he'll find his place among professionals." Luis's chest tightened, but he stayed silent. Years of being dismissed had taught him that arguing only made the wall higher. Keanu, however, did not look away. "Sometimes the professionals are the ones who forget what art really is." Arthur blinked, caught off guard. And what would that be, in your opinion? Keanu looked toward the stage, where the next painting glimmered under the lights. Truth, he said simply. Art should tell the truth, even if it makes people uncomfortable. For a brief moment, silence fell between them. Arthur's jaw tightened, then he forced another smile. Indeed. Well, we'll make sure the truth looks presentable. He turned sharply and walked away, the echo of his shoes cutting through the music. Luis exhaled slowly, a mixture of awe and disbelief in his eyes. You didn't have to say that. Keanu turned back to him. Yes, I did. Some doors stay closed until someone knocks louder. Luis stared at the floor, his throat tight with gratitude he couldn't express. For the first time, he didn't feel entirely alone in that crowded, polished room. Somewhere between the chandeliers and the stairs, a quiet understanding had taken root. Arthur Gray took the microphone with the easy confidence of a man who had rehearsed every syllable. His voice carried through the hall, smooth as the polished marble beneath his feet. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the annual Greystone Charity Art Auction, he announced. Tonight we celebrate creativity, generosity, and the boundless beauty of human imagination. Applause rippled across the room. Champagne glasses clinked. The hum of conversation faded into expectation. A soft classical melody began to play as assistants unveiled the first piece, a modern abstract of swirling silver and red, mounted in an ornate frame. The first piece of the evening, Arthur continued, comes from one of the most promising artists in Los Angeles, Clarissa Vale. Starting bid, $25,000. Hands lifted effortlessly. 25, 30, 35. The numbers climbed quickly. Each new bid brought applause, polite smiles, and a new sip of champagne. Luis stood near the back, his canvas still tucked under his arm. The light from the chandelier hit the edges of its brown wrapping, glinting softly like a secret waiting to be told. He watched in silence as thousands changed hands for a single painting. His eyes traced the colors on the canvas being sold, then fell to his own calloused fingers cracked from paint thinner, rough from days spent painting walls instead of dreams. From his place across the room, Keanu noticed him. While the others admired the art on the walls, Keanu's gaze stayed fixed on the man who stood quietly behind them. He saw the faint smudges of dried pigment beneath Luis's nails, the careful way he held his own painting like something sacred. Luis's heart pounded as another sale closed at $50,000. He couldn't help imagining what it would feel like to hear his name announced, to see people bidding for his work. But that hope quickly gave way to a familiar ache. People like him didn't belong here. A waiter passed by with a tray of champagne. Luis tried to step aside, but the waiter brushed too close. The glass tipped, spilling golden liquid across Luis's shirt. The sound of breaking glass followed, sharp and sudden. Heads turned. "Oh, I'm sorry," the waiter gasped, bending down quickly. "It's fine," Luis murmured, trying to hide the spreading stain on his faded shirt. From a nearby table, laughter rippled soft but unmistakable. "I guess the help's getting a little too close," a man joked, drawing chuckles from his companions. Luis's cheeks burned. He turned away, eyes fixed on the floor. But before he could retreat, a familiar hand reached for a napkin. Keanu was beside him in an instant, dabbing at the wet fabric with calm precision. "Don't worry about it," Keanu said quietly. "It's just a shirt." The laughter nearby softened to silence. Luis looked up, unsure what to say. Keanu met his eyes. "They laugh because they've never painted with their own hands," he said, his voice steady, almost tender. "They don't know what real work feels like." Luis swallowed hard, his throat tight. For the first time that night, he didn't feel small. The moment passed quietly, yet its weight lingered in the air. People tried to return to their conversations, but the laughter didn't come back as easily. Luis stood motionless for a second, his shirt damp but his spirit strangely steadier. He managed a faint smile at Keanu. "Thank you," he said softly. Keanu shrugged gently. "For what? Helping a friend?" Luis blinked. The word friend felt almost foreign. It had been years since anyone had used it that way with him. You don't even know me." Keanu's tone was calm. "I know enough." They stood together for a moment, silent, as the next painting was wheeled to the stage. Arthur's voice carried through the hall again, rich and rehearsed. Next up, a remarkable piece from a Parisian visionary, entitled Silence Before the Storm. Starting bid, 40,000. The audience reacted instantly. Numbers climbed. Bids were shouted from every corner of the room. The painting, a stormy blend of blue and gray, reflected perfectly in Luis's eyes. He whispered under his breath, 40,000? For that? Keanu heard him. It's not the paint they're buying. It's the name. Luis exhaled slowly. Names I can't afford to have. Keanu turned toward him. That's how they win. They make you believe your work has no place here. Luis studied his hands again. I spend my days painting other people's walls. By the time I touch my own canvas, I'm too tired to dream. His voice carried the fatigue of years spent unseen. Keanu nodded. That exhaustion, that's truth. Art needs truth. Luis looked up, uncertain if he believed that anymore. Across the room, a new cheer rose as another painting sold for nearly $100,000. Cameras flashed. Champagne glasses lifted. Arthur smiled proudly on stage, glowing in the reflection of other people's wealth. Luis looked away, focusing on the subtle details. Others missed the uneven lighting, the shadows, where colors didn't quite meet. It wasn't jealousy he felt, it was distance. These people lived in a world where art was an accessory, not a heartbeat. Keanu noticed his expression. You see things others can't, he said. Luis frowned. What good is seeing if no one's looking back? Keanu smiled faintly. Then maybe it's time someone did. Their eyes met briefly. Luis didn't understand what Keanu meant, not yet. But something in his tone carried a quiet promise. Arthur clapped his hands, drawing the room's attention again. Before our next item, he said, I'd like to thank our generous patrons for continuing to make nights like this possible. Art is the soul of civilization, and tonight, that soul is alive and thriving. The audience applauded. Politely. Luis didn't clap. He was thinking of his tiny apartment, where unfinished canvases leaned against the wall, gathering dust in silence. For the first time in a long time, he wished the world could see them just once before they faded like forgotten color. Arthur moved on to the next item, his tone filled with showmanship. Assistants unveiled a glittering portrait framed in gold leaf. The spotlight caught the edges perfectly, and the audience murmured in admiration. This is Reflections of Power by renowned artist Marius Delacroix, Arthur announced, starting at 80,000. Within seconds, bids poured in. 85, 90, 100,000. Each number climbed higher, almost mechanical, as if the art itself no longer mattered, only the prestige of owning it. The rhythm of bidding was hypnotic, and Luis found himself studying not the paintings, but the faces of those who bought them. There was no awe in their eyes, only calculation. Beside him, Keanu remained still, watching Luis more than the stage. He saw how the young man's jaw tightened with every sale, how his knuckles whitened around the frame of his own painting. You worked on that piece yourself? Keanu asked gently. Luis nodded. Every night after work, I use scraps of old wood for the frame. The paint, some of it's mixed from leftover house paint I brought home. I wanted to show the sunrise over downtown. The kind of morning most people don't stop to notice. Keanu's expression softened. That sounds like something worth seeing. Luis gave a small, uncertain laugh. Not here. They'd call it unfinished, too raw, too ordinary. Keanu's gaze didn't waver. Maybe that's exactly what makes it real. Luis looked away, trying to ignore the hollow applause echoing through the room as the next painting sold for 200,000. The number felt unreal, detached from any sense of human effort. He imagined how many months of rent that could cover, how many nights of painting and peace it could buy. Arthur's voice rose again. And now, a truly magnificent piece, a symbolic representation of modern urban decay by Armand Keller. Starting bid, 70,000. Luis barely listened. His mind wandered to the mural he'd painted behind a local cafe, a piece no one knew was his. It showed two hands, one rough and calloused, the other delicate, reaching toward each other but never touching. Every morning as he passed it on his way to work, he thought about how people would stop to take photos but never wonder who painted it. Keanu's voice broke through his thoughts. "You ever think of showing your work publicly?" Luis smiled faintly. "Who'd care?" "I would," Keanu said. Luis looked up. There was no performance in his tone. No pity, only quiet sincerity. For a moment, it silenced the noise of the auction. A new round of applause erupted as another sale closed, and Arthur raised his glass. "Tonight proves that art still has power," he declared. The crowd cheered. Luis didn't join in. He turned slightly toward Keanu and whispered, "Power shouldn't cost that much." Keanu gave a soft, knowing smile. "You're right, Luis. The most powerful art doesn't hang behind velvet ropes." The two men stood together in that glittering hall, one world worn, one world famous, watching a parade of beauty, stripped of meaning. Neither spoke again, but both understood what was missing. The bidding quieted as the next painting was carried away, leaving a brief lull in the program. The audience chatted idly, their voices rising and falling in soft murmurs. Luis stood beside Keanu, still gripping his own wrapped canvas tightly, as though the crowd's indifference might somehow reach through the paper and smother it. Keanu noticed the way Luis's hands trembled. "What did you bring with you?" he asked, his tone casual but curious. Luis hesitated. "Just something I painted," he said quietly. "It's nothing special. I didn't think it belonged here." Keanu tilted his head slightly. "Why not?" Luis gave a small, nervous laugh. "Because people here buy names, not paintings. Mine's worth less than the frame." Keanu smiled faintly. "Let me be the judge of that." Before Luis could protest, Keanu gently reached for the canvas. Luis hesitated, then handed it over, his stomach tightening as if exposing a secret. Keanu carefully peeled away the brown wrapping, revealing the painting beneath. The crowd noise seemed to fade. The image was a sweeping view of downtown Los Angeles at sunrise. The sky burned with streaks of gold and violet. The buildings caught light unevenly, some glowing, others still asleep in shadow. In the foreground stood a construction worker, small but dignified, gazing toward the horizon as if dreaming of something beyond the skyline. Keanu stared at it, his eyes tracing the brushwork, rough, layered, imperfect, yet alive. The strokes carried emotion that no training could teach. "This," he murmured, "is beautiful." Luis lowered his gaze, embarrassed. "It's unfinished," he said. "I ran out of paint before I could finish the sky." Keanu shook his head slowly. Sometimes unfinished things tell the truest story. Nearby, Arthur noticed the commotion. His practiced smile faltered slightly as he spotted Keanu holding an unlisted painting. He strode over, voice polite but edged with irritation. "Keanu, what's this?" Keanu turned the painting slightly toward him. "Something you need to see." Arthur's brow arched. "Where did that come from?" "From him," Keanu replied, nodding toward Luis. Arthur blinked, his tone turning sharp. "From the gentleman you brought? You can't just display unregistered work in the middle of a curated auction. It isn't how we operate." Keanu's voice remained calm. "You said, tonight celebrates art and imagination. Well, here it is." Arthur chuckled softly, trying to diffuse the tension. "I'm sure it's heartfelt. But we don't show unfinished local pieces here. Our audience expects refinement." Keanu looked him straight in the eye. "Then maybe it's time you did." A hush fell over the nearby guests. Some turned to listen. Others whispered. Luis's face flushed as curiosity spread through the crowd like ripples on water. He reached out, his voice low and urgent. "Please, I didn't mean to cause trouble." But Keanu didn't move. His gaze stayed fixed on the painting, his expression unreadable, as though he was seeing something deeper than color. Arthur forced a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. The tension around him was palpable. "Keanu," he said smoothly, lowering his voice, "this isn't the time or place. These people are here to support established artists, We can't just— Keanu interrupted softly. You can't, or you won't? Arthur blinked. I'm saying there are standards. Whose standards? Keanu asked, his tone even but firm. The surrounding guests turned their attention toward them, drawn by the quiet defiance in his voice. A woman whispered to her husband, "What's going on?" Another man leaned in closer to see. The lights reflected off crystal glasses, but the air carried a strange stillness, an unspoken curiosity that dared someone to break the script. Luis's heart pounded. He wanted to disappear, to melt into the marble floor. But Keanu stood calm beside him, the painting still in hand. The canvas caught the chandelier light, glowing softly, and for a fleeting second, it seemed as though the sunrise Luis had painted was alive in the room. Arthur sighed, clearly irritated by the growing attention. Look, I understand your intentions, he said quietly, but this isn't how our events work. You can't just walk in with honesty? Keanu asked gently. Because that's what this is. Arthur's smile faltered. You think that's what this crowd wants? Keanu turned to look at the guests, then back at Arthur. Maybe they don't know what they want anymore. Murmurs spread through the crowd like wind stirring dry leaves. The social mask of the evening had cracked, and no one seemed sure whether to be amused or uncomfortable. Luis finally found his voice. Please, he said softly, his eyes darting around. Let's not make a scene. Keanu glanced at him. Sometimes a scene is what makes people finally look. He raised the painting slightly, letting the room see it. For a moment, no one spoke. The contrast was startling, the unpolished wooden frame, the raw brushstrokes, the vibrant morning light breaking through city haze. It didn't match the glossy perfection of the other paintings, but it had something none of them did. Heart. A man near the back squinted. Who painted that? Keanu's voice was steady. Luis Ortega. Some guests exchanged puzzled looks. The name meant nothing to them, which was exactly the point. Arthur folded his arms, trying to maintain control. Very touching, he said. But we have a schedule to keep. Keanu's gaze didn't waver. Then add this to it. A soft laugh came from somewhere in the crowd, followed by whispers that quickly spread. Luis's pulse raced. He stepped closer, his voice low and anxious. Please, just put it away. I don't want them to laugh at me. Keanu turned toward him. They're not laughing at you. They're laughing because they've forgotten what it's like to feel. For a heartbeat, no one said a word. Even the music seemed to pause. Luis's painting as sunrise hung between them, fragile yet defiant, waiting for someone brave enough to see it for what it was. Arthur's composure began to slip. He could feel eyes on him from every direction, watching how he would respond. His entire career was built on appearances, on control. All right, he said, with forced patience. If we're truly doing this, let's be clear. This piece isn't on the docket. There's no appraisal, no provenance, no record. It's not even framed to standard. Keanu looked at him evenly. Then you're about to witness something that doesn't need validation. Arthur's jaw tightened. You're turning this into a spectacle. Keanu glanced at the crowd, his tone soft but unyielding. No, I'm reminding everyone here what art really is. A murmur rippled through the audience again, some skeptical, some intrigued. Luis felt their eyes pressing on him like heat. He tried to step back, but Keanu steadied him with a reassuring hand on his shoulder. Stand tall, Keanu said quietly. You made this. Own it. Luis's voice trembled. They'll think it's a joke. Keanu shook his head. Then let them laugh. The truth usually sounds like one at first. Arthur exhaled sharply, clearly irritated. Fine, he said, gesturing toward the stage with a wave of resignation. If you're so certain this will enlighten them, show it. But don't say I didn't warn you. The assistants hesitated. No one wanted to risk offending Arthur or Keanu. Finally, Keanu himself stepped forward and set the painting gently on a stand near the front, where the lights could touch it. Gasps spread quietly through the room. Under the chandelier glow, the painting came alive. The rough edges gave way to warmth. The brushstrokes told a story of exhaustion and hope of a man who worked through the night to capture the first light of morning. The hues of gold and violet met at the skyline like two worlds colliding. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. A woman near the front whispered, "It's beautiful." Another frowned. "It's messy," a third said softly. "It feels like home." Luis's chest tightened as he listened. He couldn't move. Every part of him felt exposed. Arthur cleared his throat, attempting to regain authority. "Yes, quite. Heartfelt," he said with a faint smirk. "But as I mentioned earlier, this isn't up to the standard of tonight's collection. It lacks the refinement," Keanu interrupted, still looking at the painting. "It lacks pretension," he said quietly. "That's what you mean." Arthur turned to him, visibly annoyed. "Keanu, this isn't about you or me. It's about maintaining dignity for the art world." Keanu looked around the room. Dignity isn't something you hang on a wall. The silence that followed was thick, like the air before a storm. Some people shifted uncomfortably. Others leaned forward, drawn to the calm certainty in his tone. Luis whispered, "I can take it back." But Keanu didn't move. His eyes stayed locked on the canvas. "No," he said softly. "Let them see it. Really see it." For the first time that night, the crowd stopped whispering. No one looked at their watches. No one sipped their drinks. Every gaze was fixed on the same thing, the simple, powerful truth painted by a man who had never been invited inside until now. Arthur laughed softly, though it sounded more like strain than humor. His perfectly rehearsed composure began to fray. "Keanu," he said, his smile tight, "this isn't one of your movie sets. We curate professional artists here." Keanu's head tilted slightly, his expression calm but unreadable. "And what defines professional, Arthur? A frame? A suit?" The laughter from the crowd stopped instantly. His words sliced through the air, echoing off marble and glass. The guests exchanged uneasy glances. A few looked down at their programs, as though reading might shield them from discomfort. Arthur blinked, his voice slipping into defense. "We have standards. This gallery upholds a level of sophistication. Our patrons expect excellence." "Excellence?" Keanu repeated. "Or familiarity?" Arthur's eyes narrowed slightly. "We feature artists who've earned their place." Keanu nodded once. "And how does one earn that place? By being born into the right room?" A quiet murmur rippled through the audience. Even those who disagreed couldn't look away. Arthur forced a chuckle, but his confidence had cracked. "Look, I appreciate what you're doing. Truly, you have a good heart, but this isn't a charity showcase." Luis shifted uncomfortably beside him. His voice was barely a whisper. "Please, don't cause trouble for me. They'll never take me seriously after this." Keanu turned to him, his expression softening. "Art isn't trouble, Luis. It's truth. And truth always makes someone uncomfortable first." Luis swallowed hard, unsure how to respond. His instinct was to retreat, but part of him felt something rising, a small, fragile pride that refused to disappear. Arthur gestured toward the painting dismissively. "It's sentimental. The brushwork is unrefined. It lacks composition and discipline. These are qualities learned through training and experience." Keanu studied him for a long moment. "You mean through privilege?" Arthur's jaw tensed. "I mean, through craft." Keanu's gaze didn't waver. "And yet this young man crafted something that's making your entire room stop breathing. Maybe you should pay attention to that." Several guests shifted uncomfortably. One older collector whispered to his wife, "He's got a point." Another frowned, glancing from the painting to Arthur. Luis lowered his head again, torn between gratitude and fear. "Please," he whispered, "I didn't come here to be defended. I just wanted someone to see it." Keanu nodded slowly. "Then let them see it." Arthur crossed his arms. "You're risking your reputation for a street painter, Keanu. Is that really what you want people to remember?" Keanu looked directly at him, voice calm but carrying unmistakable weight. "If defending honesty risks my reputation, then maybe it's worth losing." The room fell into a silence so deep that even the distant hum of the air conditioning seemed to stop. Arthur's face flushed slightly, and his polished confidence began to crumble. A reckoning was unfolding, and everyone in the room could feel it. Arthur took a slow breath, attempting to gather his composure. He gave a tight smile, the kind people wear when they feel control slipping. "Keanu," he said lightly, "you've made a career out of performance. But this," he gestured toward the painting, "isn't a performance. This is a serious industry. There are standards, processes, certifications, things you can't bypass with good intentions." Keanu didn't look away. His tone stayed calm, measured, and direct. "You call it an industry. That's the problem. You turn something human into something you can price." The room stiffened. A few people whispered, unsure whether to applaud or keep silent. The tension between Arthur's authority and Keanu's quiet conviction filled the air like static. Arthur chuckled dryly. "So, what do you propose? We let anyone who can pick up a brush hang their work here?" Keanu took a step closer. "No, but maybe you stop deciding who's allowed to dream." The words landed hard. Even those who had dismissed Luis's painting now leaned forward, curious. Arthur's confident grin faded. "Dreams don't pay for gallery lights," he said flatly. "Our patrons fund artists who represent excellence, not hobbyists." Keanu looked back at Luis. "Tell me, Luis, how many hours do you paint after work?" Luis hesitated. 4, sometimes 5. Depends if I can afford supplies." Keanu nodded, then turned to the audience. 4 or 5 hours after painting houses all day. He's not a hobbyist. He's a craftsman who refuses to quit. "That's excellence." Murmurs broke out across the room. Some nodded quietly. Others shifted uncomfortably. Arthur raised his hands. Fine, you've made your point. But this still isn't a place for sentiment. Art is about vision, not pity." Keanu's gaze sharpened slightly. "You mistake empathy for pity, and you mistake vision for vanity." Arthur's lips parted, but no words came out. The guests were no longer on his side. They were captivated by Keanu's calm defiance. Luis tried again to intervene. "Keanu, really, it's okay," he said softly. "I don't need this. I just wanted to drop off the painting. It doesn't belong here." Keanu turned toward him, lowering his voice. "It belongs anywhere it can be seen. You painted the truth of this city. You gave light to what people step over every day." Luis blinked, his throat tightening. He wasn't used to being spoken of that way. Arthur crossed his arms, visibly frustrated. "And what truth is that? That life is hard? That working people are noble? Spare me the romanticism. Art is about perspective, not struggle." Keanu's voice deepened slightly. "Struggle is perspective. The world looks different when you're painting walls for a living instead of decorating them." The audience murmured again, this time with quiet approval. A woman in the second row whispered, "He's right." Another man lowered his paddle, his interest in the next auction piece forgotten. Arthur felt the shift. His control over the room was slipping, and Keanu's calm presence had taken its place. Arthur's smile finally broke. His polished facade gave way to irritation. "You think this is noble, don't you?" he said. "Standing up for someone who doesn't even belong in this room. You're forgetting that there are rules for a reason." Keanu took a slow breath. "Rules can protect, or they can exclude. Depends on who writes them." That line hit harder than anyone expected. Several guests froze mid-sip, their expressions uncertain. A few who had mocked Luis earlier now looked uneasy, as if realizing the mirror being held up to them. Arthur tried again, this time louder, desperate to reclaim his authority. "This is a prestigious event. These walls are for artists who've spent years mastering their technique, refining their craft under mentorship and discipline. You can't just walk in off the street with a paint-splattered shirt and expect respect." Keanu's gaze was unwavering. He didn't ask for respect. He asked to be seen. There's a difference. Luis looked between them, the conversation feeling too large, too heavy. "Please," he murmured, "don't fight for me. I don't belong here." Keanu turned to him gently. That's what they want you to believe, Arthur scoffed. They? You make it sound like some conspiracy. Keanu didn't raise his voice. It's not a conspiracy when the same doors stay closed for the same people, Arthur. The silence that followed was sharper than any argument. Luis could feel every eye in the room on him, but this time, it wasn't all judgment. Some faces showed empathy, hesitant, fragile, but real. A man near the back nodded quietly, and a woman whispered something that sounded like agreement. Arthur's voice softened, though the edge remained. You're making a spectacle of a man who didn't ask for this. Keanu's tone was steady. You're mistaking exposure for humiliation. Sometimes the only way to challenge blindness is to make people see. Arthur folded his arms, visibly cornered. You're not going to change an industry in one night. Keanu's lips curved into the faintest smile. Maybe not, but you can start by changing a room. A small murmur of applause came from somewhere in the crowd, hesitant but sincere. The sound spread slowly, uneven, uncertain, but growing. It wasn't loud, but it was enough to make Arthur's composure falter completely. Luis stared, stunned. He had never been applauded before, not for a job, not for a painting, not for anything. His throat tightened, emotion catching him off guard. Keanu placed a steady hand on his shoulder. Don't hide anymore, he said quietly. This is your moment. Let them see what you see. Luis met his eyes, trembling. What if they don't understand? Keanu smiled softly. They don't have to. Art doesn't ask for permission. Arthur looked around helplessly, realizing the room was no longer his. The crowd had shifted, leaning not toward prestige, but toward truth. In that moment, the entire hall felt different. The chandeliers still glimmered, the champagne still sparkled, but for once, beauty wasn't hanging on the walls. It was standing right there, in paint-stained jeans, next to Keanu Reeves. The sound of rain against a cracked window filled the small apartment. Luis sat cross-legged on the worn wooden floor, a paintbrush in one hand, a chipped mug of coffee in the other. The air smelled faintly of turpentine and toast. His latest canvas leaned against the wall, half-finished, glowing with streaks of dawn-colored light. It was early, too early for anyone else to be awake, but this was his. Only time to paint before work began. He glanced at the clock. 5:12 a.m. Another hour, and he would have to leave for the construction site. His hands, still rough from handling ladders and brushes covered in industrial paint, trembled slightly as he dipped the brush into a jar of color. The pigment was homemade acrylic, mixed with bits of leftover house paint from his day jobs. It wasn't perfect, but it worked. Across the room, stacks of old canvases lined the wall. Some were covered in dust, others still damp with color. Each one told a story of a different season of his life. His mother watering plants on their balcony, the view from their neighborhood bus stop, the skyline at dusk. They were windows into moments no one else had ever seen. Luis's mother had once told him he was born seeing color differently. As a child, he used to sit on the fire escape for hours, watching how light changed the world. She would laugh and say, "One day, you'll paint something the world remembers." He believed her then. But when his father died in a roofing accident, everything changed. Luis was only 19. He quit community college 2 months later to work full-time as a building painter. Someone had to pay rent, buy food, keep the lights on. His mother's health began to falter soon after. The dream of art school turned into a dream of survival. That morning, the city outside his window hummed faintly, traffic, voices, the steady rhythm of another long day. He added another stroke to the canvas, the color glowing softly in the dim light. His eyes traced the rising sun in his painting, and for a brief moment, he imagined what it would feel like to have this piece hanging in a gallery. But the thought faded quickly. A knock sounded at his door. It was his neighbor, Clara, a middle-aged woman who always left for her cleaning job around the same time. She peeked in, smiling warmly. "You're at it again, huh?" Luis laughed. "You know me." She glanced at the trote. "Paintings covering the floor. You're wasting your talent, Luis. You should be showing these somewhere." He smiled faintly, his brush still moving. "Talent doesn't pay rent, Clara," she sighed. "Maybe not, but it feeds the soul." He didn't answer. He just kept painting, his eyes locked on the horizon. He'd created one that seemed so close, yet always just out of reach. By 7 o'clock, the painting lay drying on the floor. Luis washed his brushes in a jar of cloudy water and stared at his reflection in it. He looked older than 27 tired eyes, lines of paint along his forearms that never seemed to wash off completely. Every color he mixed left a mark somewhere on him, as if his body had become part of his art. He grabbed his worn denim jacket, pulled on steel-toed boots, and slung his work bag over his shoulder. The stairwell of his apartment building smelled faintly of bleach and rain. The walls were chipped, but he always found beauty in the imperfections. He used to tell himself, "Someday I'll paint this place the way it deserves to be seen." Outside, the city was waking up. Trucks rumbled down the street, vendors opened their stalls, and the pale light of morning filtered through power lines and billboard signs. Luis stopped at the corner store for a sandwich and a small can of cheap coffee. The cashier, an old man with kind eyes, greeted him. "Still painting those skylines, Luis?" Luis smiled wearily. "When I can." "You'll get your break," the man said. "Hard work always finds a way." Luis nodded politely, though he didn't quite believe it. He'd heard that before from teachers, friends, even his mother before her health declined. But life hadn't opened many doors for him. He learned to stop expecting them to. At the construction site, the smell of paint and plaster filled the air. The foreman barked orders, and men in hard hats scattered to their tasks. Luis climbed scaffolding with practiced ease, brush in hand, painting the beige walls of an office complex. The rhythm of work was steady, almost meditative: dip, stroke, move, repeat. Around midday, he took a break, sitting on the edge of the scaffolding with his lunch. From there, he could see downtown in the distance, sunlight bouncing off skyscrapers. He imagined his painting again, the same skyline, but glowing, alive. His co-worker, Marco, joined him. "You still doing those little paintings?" he asked, biting into his sandwich. Luis nodded. "Yeah," Marco grinned. "Man, you should show him somewhere. Maybe you'll get lucky, huh?" Luis chuckled softly. "Luck's for people with time." Marco shrugged. "Maybe, but you never know who's watching." The words lingered. Luis didn't realize it then, but they would come back to him in the most unexpected way. When the shift ended, he returned home exhausted, covered in dust and flecks of white paint. The city was quiet again, the same as when he'd left that morning. He passed his neighbor's door, Clara's, radio playing softly inside, and stopped for a second to listen. Then he climbed the final steps to his apartment and turned on the single lamp beside his easel. The unfinished painting waited. He sat down slowly, hands trembling from fatigue, and picked up his brush again. "Just one more stroke," he whispered. The night stretched long and quiet. Luis's apartment was lit only by the soft glow of a desk lamp, its light falling across streaks of color drying unevenly on the canvas. He leaned forward, brush poised, fighting the exhaustion that made his hand tremble. Each stroke came slower than the one before, yet more deliberate, like a heartbeat refusing to fade. The radio played faintly in the background, a song his mother used to hum while cooking. He stopped painting for a moment, listening. Memories filled the room, the smell of beans simmering on the stove. His mother's laughter when he spilled paint on the floor as a boy, the way she always said, "Don't worry, mijo, the mess is part of the beauty." He glanced at a photo taped to the wall, his parents on their wedding day, both smiling. His father's hands resting on a paint roller instead of a bouquet. That old roller still leaned in the corner, its handle chipped but intact. Luis had kept it all these years, a reminder of the man who taught him that even work with no glory still had worth. The memory of that day on the roof flashed vividly. His father had come home covered in dust, laughing despite the fatigue. "You'll go further than me, Luisito," he'd said, handing him a small sketchbook. "Fill this with things that make you feel alive." Luis had filled every page. Then, just months later, the accident took him. He swallowed hard, blinking back tears. The grief had faded over the years, but the emptiness stayed, a quiet companion that never left. He dipped his brush in yellow and traced the horizon line, his father's words echoing in his mind. The front door creaked open softly. His mother's voice, thin and weary, drifted from the hallway. "You're still up?" "Almost done," he said. "You should rest." She smiled faintly as she entered, wrapped in a shawl. "You work too much." "So do you," he replied gently. Her gaze fell on the painting. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "You make the world look kinder than it is." Louis smiled. "Maybe that's the point." She rested a hand on his shoulder. "Your father would have been proud." Her voice trembled slightly, and she quickly turned away to hide her tears. When she went back to bed, Louis stared at the canvas again. The city skyline shimmered beneath his brush. It wasn't perfect, but it felt alive, like a conversation between light and hope. Outside, the streetlight flickered. He leaned back, wiping sweat and paint from his forehead, and whispered to the empty room. "One day, they'll see you, Papa. They'll see what you taught me." The words hung in the air, soft but sure. He didn't know when that day would come, or if it ever would. But he painted anyway, because stopping would mean letting the world go gray, and he refused to live without color. The tension in the room hadn't faded. Even after the brief standoff, the air felt charged, like a storm waiting to break. Luis stood near the wall again, holding his hands together tightly, eyes fixed on the floor. He could feel the bright lights pressing down on him, making him smaller with every passing second. He wished he could melt into the marble beneath his feet. Across the room, Keanu watched him silently. While others had already moved on, pretending to forget the scene that had unfolded, Keanu hadn't stopped thinking about it. He saw the subtle tremor in Luis's hands, the way his shoulders curved inward as if trying to protect something fragile inside himself. Arthur was now directing assistants to prepare the next item, eager to restore normalcy. His voice was smooth again, almost cheerful. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll continue with the evening's program. Next up, a limited edition sculpture from the renowned European artist Keanu," interrupted him, quietly but firmly. "Arthur." Arthur froze. The microphone caught the sound of his name, and the audience turned their attention toward the two men again. "Yes?" he said, trying to maintain his composure. Keanu stepped forward, his calm tone carrying across the room. "I'll make you a deal." Arthur blinked. "A deal?" Keanu gestured toward Luis's painting, still resting near the edge of the stage where he had placed it earlier. "Put this piece up next. If it doesn't move the crowd, I'll match the last sale myself." Arthur's eyebrows shot up. "You're serious?" Keanu nodded once. "Dead serious." The crowd stirred again, their curiosity rekindled. Someone whispered, "He's really doing this." Another muttered, "This'll be interesting." Arthur forced a polite laugh, though irritation flickered in his eyes. "Keanu, I admire your enthusiasm, but we can't just throw protocol aside. The pieces tonight are curated. We have a flow." Keanu's tone didn't change. "Then make this part of the flow." Arthur opened his mouth to object, but something in Keanu's expression stopped him. It wasn't arrogance or defiance, it was conviction, the kind that leaves no room for argument. After a long pause, Arthur sighed and gestured to his assistants. "Fine, if that's what you want." The assistants exchanged nervous glances but moved toward the painting. Luis stepped forward instinctively. "Please, don't," he said under his breath. "They'll just laugh again." Keanu placed a steady hand on his shoulder. "Then let them. You can't teach eyes that refuse to see, but you can show them what they're missing." Luis stared at him, unsure whether to feel comforted or terrified. His stomach twisted as the assistants carefully lifted his painting and placed it on the stage. The bright lights hit the colors like a sunrise, illuminating every imperfect brushstroke. It looked alive in a way that the polished pieces before it hadn't. From the corner of the room, a voice chuckled softly. "Who painted that? The janitor?" Another joined in, louder. "Maybe it's performance art." Luis's pulse hammered in his ears, but Keanu didn't flinch. He crossed his arms, his gaze fixed on the stage, steady and calm as stone. The laughter rippled briefly, uncomfortable and uncertain. Luis stood frozen, his face pale beneath the lights. His first instinct was to rush forward and take the painting down before they could mock it further, but Keanu's quiet steadiness anchored him in place. Arthur adjusted his jacket, forcing another thin smile. "All right then," he said into the microphone, his tone somewhere between amusement and discomfort. "Let's continue. We have a special impromptu addition to our auction tonight, a piece by Mr. Luis Ortega." The name echoed through the hall like a foreign word. A few people murmured, flipping through their catalogs, realizing he wasn't listed anywhere. Arthur continued. "A local painter, apparently. A touching story, I'm sure. Let's start the bidding at $100. A few guests chuckled softly. No one raised a paddle. The silence felt endless. Luis's chest tightened, his hands curled into fists at his sides. He whispered, "Please, make them stop." Keanu leaned closer. "Not yet." Arthur tapped the microphone again. "Anyone for 100?" he asked with strained cheer. "It's for charity, after all." Still nothing. Only the faint clinking of glasses, the shuffle of expensive shoes. Someone whispered near the front, "It's nice, but it's not gallery work." Keanu's eyes never left the painting. To him, it looked like a heartbeat alive, flawed, real. The kind of art that didn't care who was watching. Luis turned slightly toward him. "They're not going to bid," he said, voice shaking. "I shouldn't have brought it." Keanu's tone remained calm. "You didn't bring it, I did." Arthur cleared his throat again, clearly eager to move on. "No interest? Then perhaps we wait," Keanu said, his voice quiet but firm. It carried through the room like a chord struck in still air. Every head turned. Arthur blinked, uncertain. "Yes?" Keanu raised his hand. 100,000. The words hit like thunder. Gasps spread through the audience. Arthur nearly dropped the microphone. 100,000. Keanu nodded once. "That's my opening bid." The silence that followed was absolute. Then, whispers began to ripple, shocked, incredulous. Some even amused. "He must be joking. He's lost his mind. It's charity. But come on." Luis stared at him in disbelief. "You can't," he whispered. "It's not worth that much." Keanu's eyes softened. "It is to me," Arthur stammered, trying to recover his professionalism. "Well, that's certainly generous. Do we have any other bids?" No one answered. No one dared. Keanu gave a single nod. "Then let's close it there." Arthur hesitated. Then, realizing the cameras were now aimed at him, struck the gavel down with a nervous laugh. "Sold for $100,000 to Mr. Keanu Reeves." The crowd erupted into applause, but it wasn't the loud, practiced clapping of polite society. It was hesitant, awkward, half admiration, half disbelief. Luis could barely move. He felt dizzy, his breath shallow. Keanu placed a steady hand on his arm, grounding him. "Now they've seen it," he said quietly. "Now they know." The sound of applause slowly faded, leaving behind a quiet hum of shock that lingered in the air. Luis stood frozen, the words 100,000 still echoing in his ears. It didn't feel real. His entire life had been a struggle to pay rent, to buy paint, to keep going, and now a single bid had changed everything in front of the very people who once laughed at him. Arthur tried to recover his authority, forcing a thin smile. "Well," he said, clearing his throat, "that was certainly unexpected. I must say, Mr. Reeves, your generosity never fails to surprise." Keanu didn't respond. His gaze was fixed on the painting, still lit under the chandelier. "It's not generosity," he said finally. "It's recognition." Arthur blinked, his smile faltering. "Recognition?" "Yes," Keanu said quietly, "because that's what real art deserves." The audience remained silent. For once, no one had anything clever to add. The joke had ended, and something heavier had taken its place. Even the waiters paused mid-step, sensing the weight of the moment. Luis stared at Keanu, his throat tight. "You didn't have to do that," he whispered. You don't even know me." Keanu turned toward him, his voice soft but steady. "I didn't have to. But I wanted to. You've spent your life painting for people who never saw you. Tonight, that changes." Luis shook, his head still overwhelmed. "It's just paint," he said. Keanu smiled faintly. "No, it's truth on canvas." Arthur, sensing his authority slipping further, forced another laugh to diffuse the tension. "Well, congratulations to the artist then. I'm sure this will be quite the story in tomorrow's papers." But the crowd wasn't laughing anymore. Some people nodded quietly. Others simply stared at Luis with a kind of reverent curiosity. The same woman who had whispered janitor earlier now looked away, embarrassed. An elderly man near the front raised his voice gently. "Son, that's a beautiful piece," he said. "Reminds me of the mornings when I used to walk to work downtown. Haven't seen light painted that honestly in years." Luis blinked, his lips parting in disbelief. For the first time, someone other than Keanu had called it beautiful. Keanu smiled slightly, glancing at the man. "That's what I saw too." Arthur rubbed his forehead, his composure now completely gone. "Fine," he said, under his breath. "If this is what we're doing tonight, so be it." He gestured toward the assistants to remove the painting, but Keanu raised a hand. "Leave it," he said. "Let it stay where it belongs." The assistants hesitated, then obeyed. The painting remained under the lights, its colors glowing softly, refusing to fade into the background again. Luis took a shaky breath. The room no longer looked intimidating. It felt different now. Quieter, humbler, almost human. Keanu turned to him, his tone calm. "Sometimes, Luis, all it takes is one person to stop the laughter and make the room listen." Luis lowered his gaze, tears pooling in his eyes. "Thank you," he whispered. Keanu's smile deepened, gentle and knowing. "Don't thank me. Thank your work." It finally spoke loud enough. The echo of the gavel still hung in the air, but the room hadn't yet remembered how to breathe. For a long moment, everything stood still. The chandelier lights shimmered against glass, and the air carried that fragile, trembling quiet that follows something no one expected to happen. Luis stood frozen in place, unable to process what had just unfolded. The number still rang in his ears, like a sound too big for his world to hold. 100,000. He could barely make rent each month. And now, someone Keanu Reeves had just placed a value on his dream that was beyond anything he could comprehend. Arthur broke the silence first, his voice trembling just slightly. "Well," he said, forcing a nervous chuckle, "I suppose that concludes this rather spontaneous addition to our program." His words tried to restore control, but the authority behind them was gone. People in the front row whispered quietly. The once dismissive guests now stared at the painting as if seeing it for the first time. They leaned forward, noticing the raw emotion in the brushwork, the imperfect beauty of color layered over color. Some even took out their phones, pretending to fix their programs, but subtly taking photos. Luis's hands were shaking. He looked at Keanu, his eyes wide. "You can't," he said, voice barely audible. "It's not worth that. I painted it on leftover canvas. I didn't even finish the sky." Keanu's expression softened, the faintest smile touching his lips. "It's worth exactly that," he said. "Because it's real." Arthur tried to laugh again, though his tone wavered. "Keanu, you're a generous man, but surely you don't mean to—" "I do," Keanu said calmly. His voice wasn't loud, but it filled the room. There was no grand gesture, no need for performance, just quiet certainty. The auctioneer looked uncertain, his gavel trembling slightly in his hand. "Then it's settled," he announced carefully. "Sold for $100,000 to Mr. Keanu Reeves." Cameras flashed instantly. The moment captured the contrast perfectly. Keanu's calm smile, Luis's tearful disbelief, and Arthur's uneasy composure. Reporters whispered to each other, sensing a headline. "Actor stuns gala with unexpected act of generosity," one murmured. "You saw that, right?" That's a story. But Keanu wasn't looking at them. He stood and walked toward the stage, each step measured and unhurried. He reached out and lifted the painting gently from its stand. The crowd watched as he turned and walked toward Luis, who still stood near the back, too stunned to move. The sound of his footsteps echoed softly. The guests leaned forward, trying to hear what he would say. When Keanu reached him, he held out the canvas and placed it in Luis's trembling hands. "You're the one who truly understands the value of color," he said. Luis tried to speak, but no words came. For the first time in his life, the world wasn't looking past him. It was looking at him. Luis's fingers tightened around the edges of the canvas, as if afraid it might vanish if he let go. His reflection wavered faintly in the glossy surface of the paint, and for a fleeting second, he saw himself not as the laborer, not as the outsider, but as an artist. His breath caught, and his lips trembled. "I don't know what to say," he whispered. Keanu smiled softly. "Then don't. Just keep painting." The crowd, which had been frozen in stunned silence, finally broke into applause. It wasn't the polite clapping of obligation. It was hesitant, genuine, and slowly growing in warmth. People who had mocked him earlier now stood, clapping harder, some even whistling softly in appreciation. The room had shifted. Something invisible had cracked open. Luis blinked rapidly, still overwhelmed. I don't deserve this," he said. Keanu looked at him with quiet certainty. "That's where you're wrong. You've been earning this your whole life." Arthur stood by the podium, torn between frustration and disbelief. His attempt to maintain composure faltered as more guests approached Luis, congratulating him, asking to see the painting up close. The same people who had sneered now looked intrigued, almost reverent. Arthur adjusted his tie, forcing a tight smile that didn't quite hide the irritation simmering beneath. A woman in a shimmering silver gown leaned toward her friend. "Do you feel it?" she whispered. "It's like that painting changed the air in the room." Her friend nodded slowly. "He painted something real. We forgot what that looked like." Keanu stepped aside, letting Luis have the space. He didn't want to be the center of it. He wanted people to see the art, the man behind it. Luis looked up, his eyes meeting Keanu's again. The gratitude in them was raw, wordless, and heavy with emotion. For a long moment, the two men stood still amid the sea of whispers, applause, and flashing lights. The contrast between them, one world famous, one almost invisible until tonight faded into something simpler. Two people connected by an understanding that needed no explanation. Reporters moved closer, snapping photos, capturing the light glinting off the painting's surface. "Mr. Reeves," one called out, "why this painting? What made you do it?" Keanu looked toward the journalist and said calmly, "Because it reminded me that art isn't about money, it's about the courage to keep creating when no one's watching." The room fell quiet again. Even the reporters lowered their cameras for a moment, absorbing his words. Luis's eyes welled with tears. He held the painting against his chest like a child clutching something sacred. "You don't know what this means to me," he said, voice breaking. Keanu's tone softened. "I think I do." Arthur finally stepped forward, voice shaky but formal. "Ladies and gentlemen, let's give a round of applause for Mr. Luis Ortega, a new name to remember." "The crowd," responded, louder this time. Some even smiled at Luis. Though they didn't know why they were moved, they only knew that something inside them had been stirred. As the applause grew, Keanu placed a hand on Luis's shoulder once more and whispered, "This isn't charity, Luis. This is justice for something beautiful." Luis nodded slowly, tears spilling freely now, and for the first time, he didn't wipe them away. The night after the auction, the story spread faster than anyone could have imagined. By morning, clips of the moment had flooded every social media feed. The video of Keanu raising his hand, calmly saying 100,000, played on repeat across the internet, comment sections filled with praise and debate. Some called it one of the most beautiful gestures they had ever seen. Others, predictably, called it a stunt. The headlines appeared one after another. Keanu Reeves stuns art gala with generous act. From janitor to genius, The mystery painter everyone's talking about. Was it real or rehearsed? Inside the auction that shocked Los Angeles. Arthur Gray gave a statement the next morning, clearly trying to control the narrative. It was a spontaneous moment, he told reporters. A touching display, though not exactly part of the evening's plan. Mr. Reeves certainly made an impression, but this wasn't a curated sale. He smiled for the cameras, but the tone of his words carried something defensive. To some, it sounded like he was protecting his reputation. To others, like he was trying to take credit for something he hadn't done. Luis watched it unfold from his small apartment, still wearing the same paint-stained shirt from the night before. He sat on the edge of his bed, the television flickering with images of him standing next to Keanu, eyes wet with tears. The anchor's voice said, "A working-class painter from East Los Angeles has become an overnight sensation. Overnight sensation." The words didn't feel real. His phone buzzed non-stop, hundreds of messages, friend requests, and interview invitations. People he hadn't heard from in years suddenly wanted to connect. Journalists knocked on his door, shouting his name from the hallway. By noon, he couldn't take it anymore. He turned off his phone, closed the blinds, and sat at his small table with a cold cup of coffee. The quiet felt heavier than the noise. In the President's Tanks's Mary hallway, Clara, his neighbor, knocked softly. "Luis, you in there?" He hesitated before opening the door. She smiled kindly. "You're famous now," she said. "I saw you on TV. I almost didn't recognize you without your paintbrush." He laughed faintly. "I don't feel famous. I feel lost." She placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Maybe fame isn't the point. Maybe the world just finally noticed what you've been doing all along." Luis nodded, but didn't answer. When she left, he sat in silence again, staring at the painting Keanu had bought, the same one that had changed everything. It leaned against the wall now, glowing softly in the afternoon light. But even that beauty couldn't quiet his unease. He thought about what Arthur had said, about the whispers online, people questioning if Keanu's act had been planned, if Luis was an actor, if the entire night had been a setup for publicity. The idea sickened him. He didn't care about fame. All he had ever wanted was to paint. By evening, the media circus had grown unbearable. Reporters crowded the sidewalk outside Luis's building, their camera lights spilling through the blinds. He hadn't eaten since morning. His stomach knotted with anxiety. Every headline seemed to twist the story further from the truth. Some praised Keanu's compassion, but others mocked it. "Hollywood hero or clever PR?" One headline read. Another said, "Was the poor painter just a prop?" Luis shut off the television and sank back into his chair. The glow of the city flickered through the cracked window. For years, no one had cared about his art. Now, everyone suddenly wanted a piece of him, but none of them seemed to care about the truth. He was exhausted, both from the noise and from trying to understand how a single night could upend everything he knew. A sharp knock came at the door. He didn't move at first. Then, a voice spoke, calm and familiar. "Luis, it's me." He froze. That voice, steady, quiet, he recognized it instantly. When he opened the door, Keanu stood there, dressed simply in jeans and a dark jacket, holding 2 paper cups of coffee. There were no cameras, no security, no entourage, just him. Luis blinked, too surprised to speak. You came here?" Keanu smiled faintly. "You didn't answer your phone." He held out one of the coffees. "Figured you could use this." Luis accepted it with trembling hands. "You shouldn't be here. The press will. They won't know," Keanu said gently. "I came through the back." They sat at the small kitchen table. The silence was thick but comforting, like 2 people who didn't need to fill it. After a long moment, Luis finally spoke. "They think you did it for attention." Keanu nodded slowly. "I've heard." Luis looked down. "I didn't want any of this. I just wanted to paint. Now everyone's calling me a fraud. They say it was all staged, that you were trying to make a point." Keanu looked at him, his voice calm but sincere. "Maybe I was trying to make a point, but not about fame. about worth. You've been living quietly, creating something true. I just gave the world a reason to look." Luis swallowed hard. "But they're twisting it. They're saying I don't deserve it." Keanu's tone softened even more. "Let them say what they want. The truth doesn't need their approval." He took a sip of coffee, then added, "You don't owe anyone an explanation, Luis. Just keep painting." The words landed like an anchor, steady, grounding, simple. Luis stared at the cup in his hands, the steam curling into the dim light. "I don't know if I can handle all this." Keanu leaned forward. "Then don't. Let the noise fade. Go back to what you love. That's what matters." A faint smile tugged at Luis's lips. "You really believe that?" Keanu's eyes met his. "I don't just believe it, I live by it." Outside, the city buzzed on headlines, opinions, endless chatter, but inside that small apartment, the world felt still again. Two men sat across from each other, united not by fame or charity, but by something simpler and deeper respect for the kind of beauty that never asks to be seen, yet refuses to be forgotten. A week passed, and the noise of the media slowly began to fade. The frenzy around Luis's name started to quiet, replaced by the usual rhythm of city life. For the first time in days, he felt a hint of peace returning. The cameras were gone, the reporters had moved on, and he could finally breathe again. That morning, as sunlight streamed through the cracks in his blinds, he heard a knock at the door. It wasn't loud, just 3 soft taps. When he opened it, there was no one there, only a small brown envelope resting on the floor. His name was written across it in clean handwriting. Inside was a folded note and a single key attached to a small brass tag engraved with an address in downtown Los Angeles. He unfolded the letter carefully. The handwriting was simple, steady, familiar. "Every artist deserves light. Use this space as long as you need. K." Luis stared at the words, his hands trembling. He looked at the key again, the sunlight glinting off its edge. He felt a lump rise in his throat. Later that afternoon, he took the bus to the address engraved on the tag. The building was an old brick warehouse that had been renovated, tucked between a coffee shop and a small bookstore. He hesitated before stepping inside. The moment he turned the key, the door creaked open, and warm light flooded the hallway. The space was breathtaking. Wide windows filled the studio with sunlight, casting long golden streaks across the floor. Paintbrushes and easels were arranged neatly near the walls, and several blank canvases leaned in the corner, waiting. A simple wooden table stood in the center, covered with fresh tubes of paint, new brushes, and a stack of sketchbooks, still wrapped in plastic. Luis took a few steps inside, stunned. He ran his fingers across the table, over the cool metal of the brushes, the rough wood beneath them. Everything smelled faintly of turpentine and possibility. He looked up at the light filtering through the tall windows and felt something he hadn't felt in years: hope. His knees gave way, and he sank slowly to the floor. Tears welled in his eyes as he pressed the key against his palm. It wasn't the gift itself that broke him. It was what it meant. Someone had seen his worth and built a space for it to grow. He whispered softly, "Thank you," though no one was there to hear it. For a long while, he just sat there, letting the sunlight wash over him. He imagined painting here, mornings filled with color, evenings quiet and peaceful. The studio didn't just feel like a room, it felt like freedom. The next morning, Luis returned to the studio before sunrise. He carried only a small duffel bag filled with his old brushes, a few clothes, and the framed photo of his parents. The streets outside were still quiet, the city not yet awake. When he opened the door, soft light from the street lamps spilled across the floor, and for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was walking into a home. He placed the photo of his parents on the windowsill, where the morning sun would soon reach it. Then he stood still for a long moment, looking around the studio. The emptiness didn't feel lonely, it felt full of possibility. He could almost hear his father's voice in his head, gentle and proud. "Make the walls sing, Luisito." He smiled, wiping a tear from his cheek. By the time the first light of dawn touched the glass, he was already painting. His hands moved with a rhythm that felt familiar and new all at once. He worked quietly, losing himself in the color and movement. Time didn't matter. All that existed was the brush, the light, and the memory of how it felt to believe again. Hours later, a knock echoed softly on the door. Luis paused, brush in hand, then wiped his fingers on a rag and walked to open it. Keanu stood there, dressed simply, his black jacket dusted with sunlight from the window behind him. No cameras, no entourage, just him, holding a paper bag from a nearby bakery. "I figured you might forget to eat," Keanu said with a faint smile. Luis laughed under his breath, still half in disbelief. "You didn't have to come," Keanu shrugged. "I wanted to see if the place felt right." Luis stepped aside to let him in. "It's more than right. It's perfect." Keanu looked around the studio, eyes moving slowly over the blank canvases, the half-finished painting on the easel, and the sunlight spilling through the windows. "You've got light," he said softly. "That's all an artist really needs." Luis hesitated. "Why did you do this? You've already done enough." Keanu turned toward him. "Because the world needs more color, Luis, and you've got enough inside you for all of us." The words hit him harder than any applause ever could. He nodded slowly, unable to speak. They stood there, in quiet understanding. Two men from different worlds, connected by something deeper than circumstance respect. Keanu walked over to the canvas Luis had started that morning. It was a work in progress, a swirl of deep blues and sunrise gold. He smiled slightly. "You're painting the city again." Luis nodded. "It's what I know." Keanu studied it for a moment, then said quietly, "Then make them see it like you do." Luis didn't answer. He didn't have to. The gratitude in his eyes said everything. Keanu set the bag on the table, gave one last look around, and said, "I'll check in from time to time, but this place is yours now. Make it count." As Keanu left, the light in the room shifted, brighter now, reflecting off the wet paint. Luis picked up his brush again and smiled. For the first time, his art wasn't just survival, it was purpose. Arthur Gray sat alone in his office a week after the auction, the glow of his laptop screen reflecting in his glasses. His once bustling gallery had gone quiet. The walls that had echoed with applause and laughter now carried only the hum of the air conditioner. His inbox was flooded with messages from sponsors, some expressing concern, others withdrawing future commitments altogether. He scrolled through the articles, headline after headline, cutting sharper than the last. Elitist gallery director embarrassed at charity auction. The night Keanu Reeves redefined what art means, his stomach turned. It wasn't just the humiliation. It was the realization that people weren't rallying against him because of Keanu's fame. They were reacting to something deeper, something honest. He clicked on one of the videos that had gone viral. The footage began mid-argument Keanu's calm defiance, the crowd's silence, the way Luis stood trembling beside his painting. Then came the moment that changed everything. Keanu's voice, steady and quiet, saying, "He's the one who truly understands the value of color." Arthur froze the frame there. He looked at Luis's face on the screen, eyes wide and full of disbelief. There was no performance in that expression, no script, just raw emotion. The crowd had felt it, and so had he. He'd just been too proud to admit it. He leaned back in his chair and rubbed his temples. For years, he'd prided himself on being a gatekeeper of taste, someone who separated the refined from the unpolished. But now that wall he'd built around himself felt more like a prison. That evening, as twilight fell over Los Angeles, Arthur made a decision. He closed his laptop, took a deep breath, and drove downtown. The address wasn't hard to find. The brick building with tall windows stood quietly under the soft glow of streetlights. He hesitated at the door, holding the note in his hand, the one Keanu had given. Luis. The message inside still echoed in his mind. Every artist deserves light. He knocked gently. A few seconds later, the door opened. Luis stood there, surprised but calm. His hands were covered in streaks of blue and gold paint, his hair slightly disheveled. "Mr. Gray?" Luis asked cautiously. Arthur swallowed. "Luis, I hope I'm not interrupting." Luis shook his head. "No, I was just finishing up." He stepped aside, letting him in. The studio was filled with warm light, the scent of turpentine, and half-finished canvases leaning against the walls. It was alive in a way Arthur's gallery hadn't felt in years. Arthur walked slowly around the room, his gaze landing on the newest painting, a wide, sweeping cityscape, vibrant and full of motion. "You did this?" he asked quietly. Luis nodded. "Started it this morning." Arthur's voice softened. "You paint light differently." Luis smiled faintly. "Maybe because I don't have much of it to waste." Arthur paused, unsure how to respond. He took a breath and finally said the words he'd been avoiding for days. "I misjudged you, Luis. I misjudged everything about that night." Luis set down his brush and looked at Arthur for a long moment. There was no anger in his eyes, only quiet understanding. "We all paint from what we see," he said finally. "Maybe you just needed a new perspective." Arthur nodded slowly, his chest tightening. "Perspective," he repeated. "That's exactly what I lost." He glanced around the studio again, taking in the soft colors, the small imperfections that gave each painting life. "You know, I used to love art like this, raw, unpolished, full of heart. Somewhere along the way, I started curating for approval instead of meaning." Luis leaned against the table, his tone gentle but honest. "It happens when you forget what it's for." Arthur met his gaze. "And what is it for?" Luis smiled faintly. "To make people feel something, not to impress them." Arthur stood silently, the truth of that settling deep inside him. The same words, if said by anyone else, would have sounded naive. But from Luis, they carried weight. He had lived them. After a moment, Arthur cleared his throat. "Luis, I came here for a reason. Not just to apologize." Luis raised an eyebrow. "Then why?" Arthur hesitated, then reached into his jacket and pulled out a small envelope. "I'd like to offer you something. A chance to exhibit your work. A proper show. Not charity. A partnership." Luis's expression faltered in surprise. "You want to host my work? After all this?" Arthur nodded. "Especially after this. I want to do it right this time." Luis's instinct was to refuse. The memory of that night, the laughter, the whispers, it all still stung. "I don't know," he said slowly. "It's not really my world." Arthur smiled faintly. "Maybe that's why it needs to be." The studio fell quiet. The sound of the city outside faded into the distance. Luis looked down at his paint-stained hands, then back at the canvas. He had never imagined being offered something like this. Yet now that it was real, he didn't want it to be about him. He wanted it to mean something bigger. He looked up again. "If we do this, I have one condition." Arthur tilted his head. "Name it." "Half of the profits," Luis said, "should go toward scholarships for working-class artists. People who can't afford supplies or tuition. People like me." Arthur blinked, caught off guard. "That's generous." Luis shook his head. "It's fair. I got lucky. They deserve a chance too." Arthur took a deep breath, then extended his hand. "Then it's a deal." Luis hesitated only a moment before shaking it. Their handshake felt like closure, but also a beginning. Two men who had once stood on opposite sides of a wall were now building something together. Arthur smiled, more sincerely this time. "You." "No, I think Keanu would approve." Luis laughed quietly. "He'd probably tell us to stop talking and start painting." Arthur chuckled, the tension easing from his face. "Then let's get to work." As Arthur left the studio, he paused at the door to look back. Luis was already at his easel again, brush in hand, bathed in the golden light from the window. For the first time in years, Arthur felt inspired not by fame or prestige, but by something purer. Art had finally found its heart again. The gallery that once turned Luis away now looked completely different. Where there had once been cold white walls and silence, there was now life-warm light spilling through tall windows, quiet laughter, and the hum of a crowd gathered for something genuine. The sign outside read simply, "The Value of Color Works by Luis Ortega." Arthur stood near the entrance, dressed more modestly than usual. He didn't wear the expensive suit that had once symbolized his authority. Instead, he wore a dark jacket and a nervous smile. Guests filed in, shaking his hand, congratulating him on such a moving concept. He knew the praise wasn't really his, it belonged to the man whose name hung above the door. Luis stood inside, his nerves twisting, though this time it wasn't fear, it was disbelief. The walls were covered with his paintings, scenes of working people, their hands weathered, their eyes alive with quiet dignity. Painters on scaffolds, janitors mopping empty halls, cooks in dim kitchens, all bathed in golden light, as if the ordinary had been made sacred. The guests moved slowly through the room, pausing longer at each piece. Some of the same critics who had once mocked him now whispered in awe. Others stood quietly, too moved to speak. The very crowd that had laughed at his stained shirt now studied every brushstroke as if searching for meaning. Arthur approached him quietly. "They love it," he said. Luis nodded, still absorbing it all. "It doesn't feel real." Arthur smiled. "That's how you know. It's honest." Across the room, a familiar figure entered unnoticed. Keanu slipped in quietly, dressed simply in black, hands in his pockets, blending easily into the background. He moved slowly from one painting to another, studying them with the same quiet intensity he had shown that night at the auction. Luis didn't see him at first. He was surrounded by guests, shaking hands, answering questions. But when he finally turned, their eyes met across the room. Keanu gave a small nod, one that said everything words didn't need to. Luis smiled back, his chest tightening with emotion. The buzz of the evening grew warmer. Laughter mingled with soft music. Someone clinked a glass to call for attention. It was Arthur. He stood near the center of the room, microphone in hand, his voice steadier than expected. "Thank you all for being here," he began. "Tonight, this gallery celebrates not just an artist, but a truth. That art isn't born from privilege. It's born from perseverance, from hands that work and hearts that refuse to give up." The audience applauded softly. Luis lowered his head, humbled. Arthur gestured toward him. "Luis Ortega reminded us that beauty exists in every corner of this city, if only we're willing to see it. His work has changed how we look at art and how we look at ourselves." Applause filled the gallery. Luis's eyes glistened as he looked out over the crowd faces that once seemed so distant, now reflecting understanding. As the applause faded, Luis stepped forward. The lights softened slightly, falling across his face as he looked out at the crowd. "I never thought I'd see this day," he began quietly. "I used to paint in a small apartment with no space, no time, and no reason to believe anyone would ever care. But someone did. Someone saw me when I didn't even see myself." The audience listened in perfect silence. Every voice, every whisper had disappeared. Luis continued, his tone steady but full of feeling. "These paintings aren't about me. They're about people like me. People who wake up before sunrise to make the world run, who go home tired, who keep going anyway. Painters, janitors, cooks, mechanics, mothers, fathers, people who make life beautiful without anyone noticing." He paused, eyes sweeping across the room. "I wanted to give them light." Applause rose again, this time fuller, louder. The emotion in the room felt heavy but pure. Reporters in the back scribbled notes, and several guests wiped their eyes. Arthur smiled proudly, the guilt of the past slowly replaced with gratitude. As the crowd began moving again, people gathered around Luis's favorite piece, a large painting at the center of the room. It showed a rainy city street, puddles reflecting blurred neon lights. In the reflection, a faint silhouette could be seen walking through the water, hands in his pockets. The figure was unmistakable. It was Keanu. The colors were soft but powerful, the glow of streetlights mixing with the shimmer of rain, the faint blue of dawn rising in the distance. It was quiet, yet alive, just like him. A young reporter stepped closer, turning to Luis. "Why did you paint this one?" she asked gently. Luis looked at the canvas for a long moment before answering. His voice came low, steady, full of emotion. "Because he saw me when no one else did." A hush, fell over the gallery. Then, as if on cue, the room erupted into applause again, this time louder than before, echoing off the high ceilings and glass walls. Even Keanu, standing in the back, lowered his head slightly, humbled. For the first time, Luis didn't shrink from the spotlight. He stood tall, proud but calm, not because of fame, but because he finally felt seen for who he truly was. A woman near the front whispered to her husband. "No," he painted gratitude. As the evening drew on, Luis noticed something beautiful happening. The guests weren't just looking at his art, they were talking to one another. Workers, critics, and collectors stood side by side, not divided by class or appearance, but connected by something deeper. Keanu quietly stepped closer, blending through the crowd until he stood beside Luis. "You did it," he said softly. Luis smiled. "No, we did." Keanu looked at him, pride in his eyes. "Then keep doing it. The world needs reminders like this." They stood together, watching as the last applause filled the room. Two men, one moment, and a room full of people, finally learning to see beauty where they once saw none. By the following week, Luis's story had spread far beyond Los Angeles. It reached every corner of the country, from morning news segments to late-night talk shows, from art blogs to social media pages filled with people sharing clips of that unforgettable moment. The headlines were everywhere. Keanu Reeves elevates working-class artists to stardom. From paint buckets to galleries, the rise of Luis Ortega. Kindness becomes the canvas. The video of the art show's standing ovation went viral. Millions watched Luis's quiet smile as he said, "Because he saw me when no one else did." Older Americans, retirees, and blue-collar workers across the country replayed those words again and again. They saw their own stories reflected in his journey. Years of being overlooked, of doing honest work that few ever thanked them for. One clip stood out among the coverage. It showed Luis walking through a studio, now bright and full of life, the walls lined with paintings of working people. A reporter's voice narrated over the footage. What began as a moment of kindness has become a movement, a reminder that beauty and worth don't depend on status, but on soul. In small towns and city neighborhoods alike, people wrote letters to Luis. Some sent photographs of themselves with paint-splattered hands or work gloves, saying his story gave them hope. Others shared how they'd picked up a paintbrush again after years of giving up. One letter came from an elderly man in Ohio. "I used to be a mechanic," it read. "I always loved painting sunsets after my shift, but I stopped when my wife passed. After seeing your story, I painted again for the first time in 20 years. Thank you for reminding me that the world still needs color." Luis kept that letter pinned to his studio wall. Despite the growing attention, he stayed humble. Invitations poured in from networks, galleries, and even major sponsors offering to buy his work for enormous sums. But he turned most of them down. He didn't want to become a celebrity. He wanted to remain an artist. When he finally agreed to appear on a talk show, it was on one condition: that it wouldn't be about fame, but about gratitude. The producers agreed, and the segment was broadcast live one Thursday evening. The host introduced him warmly. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the man who turned humility into art, Luis Ortega." Luis walked out to a standing ovation. He looked a little nervous, but composed, dressed simply in a dark shirt and jeans. When the applause quieted, the host asked, "Luis, what did that moment mean to you when Keanu raised his hand and changed your life?" Luis smiled softly. "He didn't change my life," he said. "He reminded me it still had value." The audience went quiet. Then he added, "He reminded me that kindness is also an art form. You don't need a canvas to practice it. Just a heart that still believes people matter." Applause filled the studio again, but Luis only bowed his head humbly, the light reflecting softly off his eyes. After the show aired, the response was overwhelming. Luis's words were quoted across news sites, printed in magazines, and replayed on television screens around the world. Kindness is also an art form. Became a trending phrase, not just a line, but a message people carried into their own lives. Teachers printed it on classroom walls, community centers, painted it on murals. Even construction workers taped it to the sides of their toolboxes as a quiet reminder of dignity in every kind of work. Meanwhile, Keanu stayed out of the spotlight, just as he always did. He avoided interviews, politely declining when reporters asked him to speak about the auction or Luis's rise. Instead, he let the story belong to the man who had earned it. But privately, he took one more step. Without any press release or announcement, Keanu donated the full value of his purchased painting $100,000 to a local art education fund. The foundation director was stunned when the anonymous donation came through, but word quietly spread soon after. When a journalist later confirmed that it was him, Keanu only said one sentence to the paper: "It wasn't a gift, it was an investment in humanity." That quote alone reignited the wave of admiration. Across social media, people shared stories of the small kindnesses they'd witnessed, linking them to Keanu's act. A janitor who found a child's lost backpack and returned it was called another artist of kindness. A retired nurse who volunteered at an after-school program said, "Maybe I don't paint, but I heal. That's my art." For Luis, life remained simple, even as his world changed. His studio doors stayed open to neighborhood kids who wanted to learn to paint. Some afternoons, he taught them for free, letting them mix colors and make a mess on purpose. "You don't have to paint perfect," he told them. "You just have to paint honest." One evening, as the sun dipped low over the city, Luis stood in front of the window of his studio, looking out at the skyline that had inspired his first painting. He thought about everything that had happened: the laughter, the auction, the disbelief, the applause, and the friendship that had grown out of it all. He smiled quietly to himself, the golden light of dusk spilling across his hands. Somewhere out there, Keanu was probably walking the same city streets, blending into the world the way he always did. Luis whispered softly, "Thank you, my friend." At that same moment, across town, Keanu sat on a park bench, watching the sunset. He didn't know why, but a small smile touched his lips, as if he'd heard the gratitude carried in the wind. He took a sip of his coffee, eyes fixed on the sky that was slowly turning the color of Luis's favorite paints, deep orange, fading into gold. And in two quiet places in one vast city, kindness painted its final stroke. It was well past midnight when Keanu parked his motorcycle outside the familiar building. The gallery that had once glimmered with chandeliers and laughter now stood silent, its windows dark and reflective under the moonlight. A light drizzle had begun to fall, leaving streaks across the glass and pooling softly along the sidewalk. He took off his helmet and looked up at the tall doors. For a moment, he hesitated. Months had passed since that unforgettable night, yet something had pulled him back here. Something quiet, unresolved. The security guard on duty recognized him immediately. "Mr. Reeves," the man said, surprised. "We're closed tonight." Keanu smiled faintly. "I know. I just wanted to walk through, just for a moment." The guard hesitated, then nodded. "Of course, take your time." Inside, the gallery was a different world. The chandeliers were dark, the polished floors now reflecting only the faint glow from the exit sign. His footsteps echoed softly as he walked past the empty walls, where new exhibits would soon hang. But to him, the room still belonged to that one night, to the color, the silence, the shock that changed everything. He stopped in front of the wall where Luis's painting had once been displayed. The space was bare now, but in his mind, he could still see it. The city at sunrise, the shimmer of gold over gray, the reflection of light on wet pavement. He stood there for a long time, hands in his pockets, listening to the hum of the quiet room. He could almost hear the murmurs of the crowd again, the laughter, the gasps, the applause that came too late, but still mattered. A faint smile touched his lips. In the silence, he remembered something his mother once told him, years ago when he was still trying to understand fame and how people looked at him differently. "Never mistake polish for worth," she had said. "Shine fades, character doesn't." Those words had stayed with him through decades of noise, criticism, and expectation. But tonight, standing in this quiet gallery, he understood them more deeply than ever. Luis's painting hadn't been polished, it hadn't been perfect, but it had been true, and that truth had been enough to outshine everything else. Keanu looked around the empty room once more. Then he reached into his jacket and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper. He found a bit of tape on the desk near the door and walked back to the wall, where he pressed the note carefully against the smooth surface. He stepped back to look at it, reading the words one last time. "For every artist turned away, may someone open the door." He smiled quietly, then turned to leave, his footsteps fading into the stillness. Outside, the rain had stopped, and the city lights glowed faintly in the distance. He slipped on his helmet, started the motorcycle, and rode away without looking back, leaving behind only that simple note, fluttering gently against the wall. When dawn crept over Los Angeles, the first to arrive at the gallery was an elderly janitor named Henry. He'd been working there for nearly 20 years, long enough to know the sound of every echo and the rhythm of every creaking floorboard. He pushed his cart through the quiet hall, humming softly, unaware that anything had changed. As he swept near the wall at the far end, something caught his eye, a small square of paper fluttering gently where no exhibit should have been. He walked closer, squinting through his thick glasses. It wasn't an accident. The note had been taped deliberately, centered perfectly on the wall. The handwriting was neat but simple, written in dark ink. Henry leaned closer and read the words slowly. "For every artist turned away, may someone open the door." He stood still for a long moment. The gallery lights had just begun to warm the room, reflecting off the polished floors. Something in those words struck deep inside him, maybe because he'd seen too many people turned away in life. He'd watched young interns arrive full of hope, only to leave discouraged. He'd seen paintings carried in and out, judged not by the story they told, but by the name on the tag. Henry didn't know who had written the note, but he felt the weight of it, the truth of it. He looked around the room, as if expecting someone to appear, but it was empty. The silence felt sacred now. He reached out, gently peeled the note from the wall, and folded it carefully. Then he slipped it into the breast pocket of his uniform close to his heart. "I'll keep it safe," he whispered. He continued his work, but something about his movements changed slower, more thoughtful. When the first staff members arrived later that morning, they found him quietly polishing the frame of a new display, humming a tune they didn't recognize. That evening, after his shift ended, Henry stopped by a small community art class in East LA. He'd been attending it on weekends for years, painting simple landscapes in watercolor. Most of the students were retirees like him, people rediscovering dreams they'd once set aside. He reached into his pocket and unfolded the note, placing it on the easel where everyone could see it. "Someone left this in the gallery last night," he said softly. "I don't know who, but I think it was meant for all of us." The room fell silent as they read the words. One woman, her hands stained with paint, smiled through tears. "Maybe that's why we keep coming here," she said. "Because even if the big doors close, someone always opens a smaller one." Henry nodded, eyes glimmering. "And maybe we're supposed to hold them open for the next person." Outside, the sun dipped low over the horizon, painting the windows gold. The note rested on the easel, catching the light. Its message simple but powerful, a quiet echo of one man's late-night visit, and the kindness that kept traveling long after he was gone. A full year had passed since that night at the auction, the night a single act of kindness changed everything. The world had moved on, but the ripples of that moment still spread quietly through lives it had touched. Luis's art had found its place. His paintings now hung in schools, libraries, and community centers across California. In one small coastal town, a mural he painted covered the side of a public school. A sunrise stretching across the entire wall, filled with the faces of workers, teachers, and children, all bathed in warm, golden light. Every morning, kids stopped to look at it before class, and teachers said it made them feel something they couldn't quite name. In another city, a hospital waiting room had one of his canvases. It showed a nurse tying her shoe in the early morning light, exhausted yet graceful. Families waiting for news would sit quietly beneath it, finding comfort in its simplicity. Back in Los Angeles, Luis's studio had transformed into more than just a workspace. It had become a haven for young artists, students who couldn't afford expensive lessons or supplies. The place was alive with laughter, paint-splattered clothes, and walls covered in colorful fingerprints. Luis spent his mornings teaching them the basics and his evenings painting beside them. He refused to take payment. They just need a place to start, he told anyone who asked. Across town, Arthur Gray's gallery had changed too. The old marble floors and pretentious lighting were gone. In their place were warm wood tones, open walls, and the sound of live music during exhibits. The new name above the door read, The People's Gallery. It featured artists from working backgrounds, welders, carpenters, bus drivers, cooks, anyone with a story worth telling through color. Arthur had learned humility the hard way, but it had turned him into a better curator and, in a strange way, a better man. The art didn't change, he once told a journalist. I did. Luis's friendship with Keanu had continued quietly through it all. They didn't see each other often, but when they did, it was never for cameras or publicity. Just two people meeting for coffee, talking about work, life, and the strange way kindness has a way of circling back. On a bright spring morning, Luis stood in his studio, preparing to repaint one of the back walls. Years of color stains covered it blues, reds, yellows, memories, layered like years of a life lived fully. He wore his old work shirt, sleeves rolled up, humming softly as he mixed the paint. He didn't hear the door open at first, but when he turned, Keanu stood there, smiling. You didn't start without me, did you? Luis laughed, surprised. You showed up? I told you I'd help repaint, Keanu said, holding up a bag of brushes and a can of paint. I keep my promises. Luis shook his head, smiling. You don't have to help, man. Keanu shrugged, dipping the brush into the paint. I'm still learning about color. The two of them stood side by side, rolling paint onto the wall as the morning light poured through the windows. The studio was quiet, except for the rhythmic sound of their brushes and the soft creak of the wooden floor. Occasionally, one of the young artists peeked through the doorway, whispering in awe that Keanu Reeves was actually painting a wall in their studio. Luis laughed when he noticed. You're causing a distraction, Keanu smiled, not looking up. Then I better make this wall worth staring at. They painted in silence for a while, the calm comfort of honest work filling the space between them. Finally, Luis said softly, You know, I never thought I'd get here. I thought my art would die stacked against my apartment wall. Keanu paused, rolling the brush slowly. Sometimes things stay hidden until the world's ready to see them. Doesn't mean they're less true. Luis glanced at him. You ever think about that night? The auction? Keanu smiled faintly. All the time. It reminded me what happens when you stop worrying about who's watching and just do what's right. Luis nodded. You changed everything for me. Keanu shook his head. No, you changed it for yourself. I just opened the door. A faint laugh escaped Luis. And you taped a note to the wall, apparently. I heard about that. Keanu chuckled. The janitor found it, didn't he? Yeah, Luis said. He brought it to a community art class. I think your words have been around the city by now. Keanu dipped his brush again, the light catching the streaks of paint on his hands. Good. Maybe someone else will pick it up and carry it forward. They worked until the wall gleamed fresh and white again. Luis stepped back, admiring their work, then smiled. Not bad for an actor, Keanu grinned. Not bad for a professional. They both laughed, the sound echoing softly through the high-ceilinged studio. It was the kind of laughter that carried relief and peace, the sound of two men who had done something good and found meaning in it. Luis wiped his hands on a rag. You know, I used to think art was about making something perfect, but now I think it's just about being honest. Keanu nodded. Exactly. Honesty lasts longer than perfection. The afternoon light began to shift, glowing warmer as the sun moved across the sky. Some of the young artists filtered back in, taking their places at easels and canvases. The studio came alive again, with the soft sounds of brushes and chatter. Keanu stood watching for a moment, his expression quiet but content. Luis turned to him. "You ever think about painting seriously?" Keanu smiled. "Every time I pick up a brush." Luis laughed. "Then maybe I should sign you up for a class." Keanu raised an eyebrow. "Only if you promise not to grade me too harshly." Luis extended his hand, still streaked with paint. "Deal." They shook hands, leaving faint smudges of white paint between their palms. It was messy, imperfect, and absolutely fitting. Outside, the sound of traffic blended with birdsong. Inside, laughter and color filled the air once more, a living canvas of friendship, humility, and the simple beauty of two men who remembered what really mattered. The sun had just dipped below the skyline when Keanu stepped out of the studio for the last time that day. The air was cool, carrying the faint scent of paint and rain. The city was alive around him, cars humming, lights flickering, people crossing the streets. But he moved slowly, quietly, hands in his pockets, taking in the rhythm of it all. Down the block, a mural stretched across an old brick wall. The colors glowed under the streetlights, vivid blues, warm golds, and deep reds swirling together in the shape of a rising Sunday. In its center was a figure holding a paintbrush, surrounded by faces of workers. A janitor, a bus driver, a nurse, a teacher, all painted in light. Luis's signature was scrawled at the bottom corner, simple and proud. Keanu stopped in front of it, smiling faintly. A group of children walked past, carrying backpacks, their laughter echoing off the buildings. One of them pointed up. "My mom says that painting makes her happy when she walks home from work," the boy said. Keanu looked at the mural again. "It makes a lot of people happy," he said softly. The boy grinned, waved, and ran ahead to catch up with his friends. Keanu stayed a little longer, his reflection merging faintly with the painted light on the wall. The mural wasn't about him. It was about everyone who'd ever been unseen, about what happens when someone decides to look a little closer. As he stood there, his voice echoed quietly in thought. "Some doors are made of gold, others are made of habit, but kindness opens them all." The city lights shimmered around him, their glow reflected in puddles from an earlier rain. He took one last look at the mural before walking on, his footsteps fading into the hum of the night. Miles away, Luis stood inside the studio, surrounded by his students. The walls were alive with color half-finished paintings drying in the warm air, brushes clattering in jars, soft laughter echoing from every corner. A young girl held up her painting of a sunrise, shyly showing it to him. Luis crouched beside her, smiling. "You made the light dance," he said gently. She blushed, whispering, "Do you think it's good?" He nodded. "I think it's honest. That's even better." Across the city, Arthur stood in his gallery, watching a new exhibit come to life. A group of factory workers from the suburbs were featured this time, their art raw and full of feeling. Arthur moved from piece to piece, smiling quietly to himself. His eyes paused on one painting a portrait of two men painting a wall together, sunlight spilling over them. The caption beneath it read, "Decency in Motion." Arthur exhaled slowly. For the first time in years, he felt at peace. Night deepened across the city, and the quiet hum of Los Angeles became almost musical, the sound of lives continuing, of stories still being written. Keanu walked along the narrow streets, his mind calm, his heart light. He passed a small cafe and noticed a street artist sketching under a flickering lamppost, their hands moving quickly, capturing faces that would soon disappear into the pages of their notebook. He smiled, recognizing the same spark that once shone in Luis's eyes, that hunger to express, to connect, to matter. He didn't interrupt. He simply paused, left a folded bill in the artist's small tip jar, and kept walking. Across town, Luis was locking up his studio. The last student had gone home, leaving behind a trail of laughter and the smell of wet paint. He turned off the lights one by one until only the faint glow from the street outside lit the room. stopped at the wall where he and Keanu had repainted a year ago. A faint streak of white still bore the mark of their hands from that day. He smiled to himself. "Still learning about color," he murmured softly, shaking his head with affection. He looked around at the room that had once been empty, now filled with life, and whispered a quiet thank you not just for the studio, but for the journey that had led him here. He no longer painted just to survive. He painted to give others permission to dream. In the following weeks, news continued to spread of how the studio was changing lives. Children from low-income families painted their first portraits. A retired teacher rediscovered watercolor. A construction worker created a piece that would later hang in Arthur's gallery. Each brushstroke, each burst of color, became another small rebellion against invisibility. Keanu returned every few months, never announced, always the same. Sometimes he painted quietly beside Luis. Other times he just swept the floors or refilled paint jars. He didn't talk much about what had happened that night at the auction. He didn't need to. The work spoke for itself. One afternoon, Luis asked him, "Do you ever wonder how far a small act of kindness can go?" Keanu smiled. "I think we stopped wondering. We're living it." Outside, the sunlight dimmed as the day began to fade. The mural on the street glowed under the amber glow of streetlights, now a landmark people stopped to admire on their way home. Children pointed at it. Strangers smiled at each other in passing. Kindness had found its place in the city's rhythm. As the camera panned across the mural over the faces of ordinary workers, the light in their eyes and the city behind them, Keanu's voice returned one last time. "Kindness isn't about saving someone," he said softly. "It's about seeing them." The screen faded to black, leaving only his voice and the soft hum of the city beneath it. Have you ever met someone who saw your worth before you did? The question lingered, gentle and reflective. Then, as the music swelled, one final invitation appeared on the screen. Tell me in the comments whose story deserves to be seen next.